Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I am Shannon Linker. I am the DMA League Director of Adult Programs, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our talk tonight. Tonight we will have a talk called The Close Encounters of the Impressionist Kind, which will look at the conservation work done as part of the DMA's exhibition, The Impressionist Revolution, from Monet to Matisse. This exhibition explores the fascinating story of Impressionism from its birth in 1874 to its legacy in the early 20th century. Told almost entirely through the DMA's exceptional holdings, this exhibition reveals the rebellious origins of the independent artist collective known as the Impressionists and the revolutionary course they charted for modern art. And now, I would like to introduce our speakers for this evening, Dr. Nicole Myers and Laura Hartman. Firstly, Dr. Nicole Myers is the Chief Curatorial and Research Officer and the Barbara Thomas Lemon Senior Curator at the Dallas Museum of Art. A specialist in French painting, she has published and lectured on wide-ranging topics from realism to symbolism, Poussin to Van Gogh. Myers joined the DMA in 2016 and leads the museum's curatorial, conservation, and library and archives departments. She also oversees the European art collection, which spans painting and sculpture from classical antiquity through the mid-20th century modernism. At the DMA, Myers has curated and co-curated numerous exhibitions, most recently the critically acclaimed Van Gogh and the Olive Groves, co-organized by the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam in 2021 and 22. Cubism in Color, The Still Lifes of Juan Gris, co-organized by the Baltimore Museum of Art in 2021. And Berthe Morisot, Woman Impressionist, co-organized with the Musée National des Beaux-Arts du Québec, the Barnes Foundation, and the Musée d'Orsay in 2018 and 19. Myers completed her MA and PhD in art history at the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University and with a dissertation of Gustave Courbet's Realist Nudes, and her BA in Art History and Archaeology and French at Washington University in St. Louis. And secondly, we have Laura Eva Hartman. She is the paintings conservator at the Dallas Museum of Art. She joined the DMA to work alongside Mark Leonard in establishing the formal Paintings Conservation Department. Hartman undertakes the examination and treatment of paintings in the DMA's collection, as well as loaned works for special exhibitions, working closely with colleagues in the curatorial and conservation departments. Notable projects include contributions to the Van Gogh and the Olive Groves exhibition and catalog, and significant treatments for works in the DMA's collection, including Jackson Pollock's Cathedral and Rufino Tamayo's Nude, just to name a few. Hartman has published widely on the use of new and innovative treatment techniques developed here at the DMA. Hartman received her MS from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. Now, please help me in welcoming Dr. Myers and Laura Hartman to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon, for that great introduction, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight to join us for this chat. We are thrilled to see so many people come out for this topic. If they don't come for conservation and impressionism, then, what are we even doing here? As you've heard already in the introduction, as you'll see through this talk, Laura and I have worked really closely together in the 8-something years that we've overlapped. We have a lot of fun when we're together, and we share a lot of common passions. So we will give you a lot of content and new things to think about tonight, and hopefully provide you with some joy and surprises, and maybe even a laugh here and there, since that's how we like to work together. As I said, with the title of our talk, consider yourselves warned that we definitely have a lot of fun with what we do. So, as you heard with Shannon, and hopefully if you haven't seen the exhibition, you will soon after this talk, the prompt for some of the treatments and some of the conservation issues that you're going to hear Laura talk about tonight was really coming in preparation for not just one, but 2 exhibitions that I've curated that opened around the same time that are currently on view right now. The first is the Impressionist Revolution from Monet to Matisse that's on view, as you know, in Chilton through November. That is really a celebration of the 150th year anniversary of the first Impressionist exhibition. And as you'll see, one of the big focuses and something we're going to take as our departure point tonight really explores how radical, rebellious, offensive, political, difficult, challenging Impressionism was when it was contemporary in the 1870s and 1880s, and trying to kind of shake us out of our contemporary charm, I would say, of lovely little dancers and Monet water lilies, and to consider them as something that was very difficult for contemporaries to appreciate in its day. And the other is an exhibition that celebrates the completion of what was about a 5-year process of bringing in an incredible gift of about 30 paintings, works on paper, and sculpture from Ralph and Cornelia Hines. That was inherited from family, a private collection, very similar in lines to the McDermott collection, for example, that includes Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and also early modernism. That is on view, no ticket needed, as part of our general admission on level 2 in the European galleries. So it was this incredible moment where we're focused on 19th century French painting and early modernist pictures as well. And there are many things that Laura has wanted to treat clean in our time together, but these works are very popular. They travel a lot around the world as well, and there's never been the right moment. And so this was the prompt, in fact, for what you're going to see tonight with a lot of the treatments, cleanings, new discoveries that were made. And so we're just absolutely delighted to share them with you this evening. So I'm going to start by giving just more context again before I turn it over to Laura to really show you how she views these works through the eyes of a conservator. Of course, I'm the art historian, so I come with a separate set often of questions. But I'm putting up on the screen one of my favorite paintings that's in the Reeves collection here at the DMA. It's in the Impressionist Revolution in Chilton. For me, it represents the epitome of what we think of and celebrate about Impressionism today. It's this beautiful, small, plein air painting by Renoir. It's called the Seine Chateau, so he's on one of the branches of the River Seine outside of Paris. We are in this immersive, watery, bright, vibrant, moving, spontaneously, rapidly painted, airy picture. And we talk about Impressionism today as a style. As you've heard, it wasn't a style, it was an independent artist who shared a certain set of modern interests and concerns that came together to exhibit their work, because there was no venue for them. There were no collectors. Nobody liked these. They thought this was ugly, by the way. We're going to talk about that a little bit. But in our minds today, when we use Impressionism as a style, as a term, I think for many of us, we think about, first and foremost, these plein air sketches, these outdoor made, before the motif, as we like to say, in the sense that the Impressionists are often celebrated as being novel, that they were painting their pictures en plein air, so that they grab their canvas, they go on site, and to capture the optical sensation of light as it interacts with air, with water, with objects in the natural world, to kind of rapidly paint that down. And so that they're painting these pictures from beginning to end, right there on the spot, to capture these fleeting moments of clouds passing. And so it's not a window on the world. It's not intended to rival photography. It's not about the contours of what we think we know about a cloud or a tree. It's about conjuring that sensation through color, through brushwork, and through a certain style of technical approaches that were incredibly innovative and radical and that we completely take for granted today. So we're starting with this painting as I think a really great indicator of, what we think about if you know Impressionism to be, innovative or maybe a bit edgier for the time, or what was so new and different about it. But interestingly enough, it wasn't the fact that it was painted en plein air. It wasn't that they were the first artists to take canvas and go outside into the landscape to capture these sensations. In fact, that was actually part of a traditional academic training. You were encouraged to go out and capture the effects of light, again, of these fleeting, changing atmospheric effects. But the idea was that you were making sketches. They were small, and you would take them back to the studio in a controlled environment and kind of make your own Photoshop montage, if you will, something even better than exists in nature, balancing out the composition, the colors, everything else. One of the things that made working on a larger scale, or for many artists working outdoors in the landscape, difficult is something, again, that we take for granted today. I don't know if you've ever thought about where the invention for the tube that you squeeze your toothpaste out of came from. But in fact, it came from 1840 in France in this very moment. And before that, if you wanted to go outside and paint in terms of artist materials, these are pig's bladders. And they were filled with very expensive pigment that artists had to buy dry as powder. They had to have the knowledge, which often meant apprenticeship, of how to even mix it properly to get the oil paint, so they would be mixing it with an oil binder. Pigments were incredibly expensive. This is before they were being synthetically produced. That starts in the mid-19th century. And these things could explode in your bag, and you lost all that money.
They would dry immediately.
They would dry out, so you would throw money away. If you had to mix it again, they wouldn't match. So it was really challenging. So working quickly on a small scale with a few colors, like we see Corot, the wonderful landscape painter, Corot behind me, painting on paper that has been mounted later on canvas or wood panel, small, you can't tell from the screen, but they were often small enough that you would just take them home with you in this painter's box. You would slot it in, paint your little impression, take it home to the studio. And so again, that was just established practice. But I already kind of, unfortunately, gave away the big reveal, which is that around the mid-19th century is when they actually invented the collapsible metal tube, which meant that your colors didn't dry out. You didn't lose them or waste them. That also meant it could be mass-produced and fabricated. And you see an explosion then of fabricators of artist supplies, both making more readily available colors. That meant you didn't have to be trained as a professional artist to be able to have paints, which meant that you get a lot more amateur Sunday painters, if you will.
And it became an industry. Really, truly became an industry.
In this moment, includes brushes.
Yep, and canvases and prepared canvases. So you were no longer having to have the skill of making a canvas, stretching your canvas. You could just go to a store and buy it, which seems so... we can just go to Jerry's Artorama down the street, but that didn't exist back then.
No, not at all. So things start to change, and I'm showing you, you've heard that I worked on Courbet, so I will give any occasion, not an impressionist, but they worshipped him. And by the way, they're not separated in time. Courbet will paint with Monet on the beaches in the 1860s of Normandy, just FYI there, I always love to point that out. But you see on the right, this incredible self-portrait by Courbet, where in the background, you see he's been dropped off by this carriage. He's gone south to visit his patron, Bria, who lives in Montpellier at the time. They're kind of, giving a greeting on the road, if you will. But why I put this up here as an illustration is that in this moment, you get a lot more landscape painters who are painting more and more in a naturalistic style and going further and further with these new materials to capture scenes that maybe were off limits before for the reasons that you've just heard. So on his back is one of these boxes. See the strap on the left? This is a 19th century plein air painting kit, by the way, that if you are lucky enough to be in Paris and go to the Petit Palais, it's in their collection, and it's amazing, by a French artist named Renoux. That was donated by his family after. So you would need an umbrella to screen your eyes, to help sort of adjust the colors, if you will, the way photographers today often have reflectors when they're taking photographs outside. And you actually see the umbrella folded here on top of the box.
Probably avoid a mean sunburn.
That too. We'll get to that. Why it's hard to paint outside. So that's kind of the beginning of it. So you start to see this around the mid-19th century. And then it completely explodes with the expansion of the railway network, which really starts to take place in the later 1850s and 1860s, where you've got trains now that are more affordable. They're going further afield into France, and it becomes much more accessible. I love those who read the French, and forgive me for not putting captions up there in English, but on the left, what you see, actually, they're both caricatures by Honoré Daumier, who is a fantastic satirist who, no one was safe, by the way, everyone's attacked, and he's an artist, which makes me laugh. On the left, you see the characters he starts to do called kind of like the pleasure trains, this idea that you have a growing middle class, it's more affordable to take the train. If you now are working in the city, not on the farm during the Industrial Revolution, you have a weekend and maybe some spare cash. And so you can actually take the train with your sweetheart or with your family and take a picnic and go to a suburb that would have been a couple of hours on foot, let's say in 45 minutes on the train, go boating, have a picnic, and come back. And it was so popular, in fact, that there were throngs of people who would go. And so on the left, you see them basically, it's kind of a joke about the fact that it's a pleasure train, but obviously it's so pleasurable to travel this way with everyone who are trying to get out of town on a Sunday. And on the right is really poking fun at this very visible explosion of landscape painters painting en plein air in this moment. So the caption reads something basically like, landscape painters, the first one copies nature and the second one copies the first one. And so as Laura was saying, there's this explosion of an industry of then creating specialized artist equipment to kind of feed this demand now. So this is from that same, and I know the quality's a bit blurry, so forgive me, but this is from that same plein air painting kit that you see, but I pointed out because, again, you would slot your picture, your study into the lid of the box with your materials. But this right here is a palette that's slotted into the bottom so that you could even you put your thumb through that, you hold the box, for example, and it was so prevalent that you even see it again in caricatures of the time from the 1860s and 1870s that there are all just these plein air painters on benches in the middle of the city, rapidly kind of jotting down their impressions of the world around them. And the caption there reads, the guy who's leaning over sort of says something like, oh, yeah, okay, maybe this is good and you've done this, and how long did it take? And the artist sort of responds and says, an hour and a half, but I think really it's been overworked. It's too much. So that's one of the other cliches, I think, maybe not a cliche, it's true and it's not true, as Laura's going to show you, about Impressionism as well, is that they were painted so rapidly, in fact, that was the goal, and that everything was done, hurried right there in that moment. And it's true for some, not true for all, as much as we love to say that. So getting, though, to this idea, though, of caricature satirists are having a field day making fun of all this artists, it's too labored, I've worked on it for a whole hour and a half. But the reality, as Laura was saying about sunburn and hats and things like that, is that working outdoors is actually really difficult. I'm showing you on the right a now lost painting by Vincent van Gogh. It's thought to be a self-portrait, hard to know, but it probably could be, given that it's an artist. He's got his pack on his back, he's got a canvas under his arm, he's toting some other supplies with a walking stick. Van Gogh writes about how brutal it is to work in Arles in southern France in the summertime. He considered himself an impressionist. That always surprises people. He worked en plein air. Laura's going to show you some really fun things in a moment about that. But he would be sunburned. He was stung by bees. He writes about this, the mosquitoes, and he would work in the middle of the day to capture the colors he wanted to capture. So it was not that fun or easy. And then on top of that, the reason I have this image of a drawing from a letter that he sends to his brother Theo is that he's drawing actually a painting of a field in Arles with people in the background, but there's a sort of wind pattern in Arles in southern France where he was called the Mistral, and there are these strong winds that would come, and it was so difficult for him to paint en plein air with his easel because it kept being blown over, and so he developed a stake hitch, small stake hitch, a little hitch basically, and draws and illustrates it for his brother to say, like, my paintings kept toppling over and I kept losing pictures because they're falling on rocks and blowing away essentially. And so this is how I'm actually able to work here during the Mistral when everyone else, is taking their siesta. We have letters from Monet when he's working along cliffs, for example, about being blown over by the wind, about damaging paintings, trying to come back, slipping on a rock, or fighting the elements. In the interest of time, cut the character I love, which is also they painted outside when it's icy and snowy, and they suffered for it because they did not have, like fleece like we have today for gloves and boots. So all of this is kind of context in thinking about what was it to paint outdoors? What did that look like? What was the experience? So knowing all this historically, that we have these letters, that we know that this industry is developing, what around these materials to encourage people to go outside. We know this to be true, but how do we actually know that it's true?
So I think in the next slide, what we're going to show is that there is when you study these things, you actually see material evidence in the paintings of all of this. So they weren't lying, they weren't making this up, they really were working outside. So I'm showing here 3 images taken with the microscope of our sheaves of wheat Van Gogh painting, and what you're seeing is actual grass and seeds and pinholes and this evidence of working outside. You can actually see in a lot of Van Gogh paintings the same pattern of almost like a clip pressed into the wet paint that gives evidence of the exact type of easel situation that he was using. You also see a lot, and we don't have time, but a lot of his paintings have impressions of other canvases stuck to the tops of really thick brushwork because he was layering his canvases, putting them under his arm, and taking them back. So just all like of that. This, it's just like that.
They get smushed.
He really was doing it. And that you see bugs, so the famous cricket that was seen around the world. But you see evidence of this physically in these paintings, which is really beautiful.
So that takes us back to this picture to set Laura up for another question that I have as an art historian, but just thinking for you again, this quintessential Impressionist, beautiful, picturesque picture. By the way, this is a railroad in the background. It was an iron bridge replacing something that was destroyed during the Franco-Prussian War. And that was seen as a hideous sight of industry. It was ugly, it was not picturesque, and that is the railroad that brought him from Paris to the suburb of Chatou, which was one of these pleasure centers where you would go boating and canoeing, on your day off. So that was one of the kind of radical aspects of it. So we're talking about plein air painting and all the challenges, but again, a lot of people were doing it. They weren't special, whether you were an academic painter or you were like a Sunday painter. So one of the other things that I love to point out, too, that was an invention of this moment, is the unusual vantage point in the composition. Because where do you think you are as the viewer in this foreground where it's just water? I'm on a boat, we're on a boat, they're on boats. This idea, though, of this new vantage point of, let's call it the first immersive experience, also did not start with them, even though they're credited for it. It started with our friend Daubigny, who they admired. Again, they overlap, but was from an older generation of Barbizon painters who created a studio boat. And he did even a whole series of etchings. You're seeing him in his own etching, a self-portrait there on the left in his studio boat. You can see all the canvases stacked. So Laura was telling you about the smushed paint and the impressions in the canvas. This is how this happens. He's doing his plein air sketch. Daubigny was actually the first painter that we're aware of that painted finished pictures beginning to end on plein air. And he built his studio boat to go up and down the different branches of the Seine to capture the views along the banks. So our painting here at the DMA that Laura expertly cleaned, one of our first projects together actually, that's his studio boat there in the background.
You can see so much Monet in this. So when you go look, I think this is in the show, but it's usually on
This one's upstairs in our galleries.
Upstairs in the gallery. You see so much influence on Monet, on these painters, and you have to look in the details, but I urge you to do it.
And to Laura's point, ta-da! So here are more Daubigny's from the 1860s. He exhibited at the official Paris Salon. Artists would have seen him, admired him, and even though he has a more impressionistic kind of look, at the same time, they're darker, naturalistic colors. It's still a kind of accepted looseness in the brushwork. So he was sort of a darling with collectors, if you will, and would show at the salon, even though he was a really modern painter for that moment. And as Laura was saying, you get a boat, and you get a boat. Everybody wants boats. So Monet admired him, as you were saying, and so that is Monet's painting of Monet's studio boat that he called Le Botin, the little boat. So he will go up and down arms of the Seine, taking views for the most part from said boat. And we have one in our collection that hopefully you know and you will see again. And on the right, Signac, a younger generation who starts as an impressionist and then is really the only real sort of collaborator with Seurat in the development of pointillism, and then the only true follower after. So this is a minute before he becomes a pointillist painter, painting the scene from Paris in the city on his boat under a bridge in the shade. He does a lot of these from the boat. And Berthe Morisot, her Port of Nice, she painted this in a boat. But it was not her own studio boat. She was vacationing in Nice with her family, and the sight of a woman painter was not something common, and in fact was something that was seen as both fascination or even a subject of ridicule. And so she writes in her letters that she was being harassed so much by women, children, people sort of at the port, that she rented a boat just to get away from the people, and then made paintings like this that are, well, I will let you talk about. Why is this, when we see this, such a hallmark, again, though, of this idea of plein air painting, of what the Impressionists are doing, and these kind of radical compositions, you know, when they are on their boats?
And Morisot was really radical in her painting. Especially, I think this is a really great example of this. If you look at details, you can see how it looks from afar pretty simple. It's a boat painting, they're brush strokes. But once you zoom in, you start seeing that she's physically scraping into the canvas. She's scratching, she's erasing. So the slide on the right, she's taking either a rag or a sharp palette knife and just scraping paint off. You can see on your left, underneath that big chunky yellow brush stroke, there's actually more scraping underneath. It's painted alla prima, all at once, wet into wet, but there's so much complexity. A lot of times in her paintings you see what I like to call chatter, because she's scraping really hard and she's making indentations, she's actively painting. In the next slide, you actually see more of that scraping, more of that vigorous brushwork, but on your left, in the very bottom corner, you see a pinhole. So more evidence of painting on a boat, painting outside. She was probably pinning her canvas onto one of those boards, and she's just so radical. You really get a sense of movement, and there are pure colors, but you can just imagine her palette and how she's moving so quickly and she's painting so fast. And another thing that she that really is a hallmark of her paintings, but of the Impressionist paintings that differs so much from those highly finished salon pictures, and is exemplified in this picture on your left, is kind of this unfinished look. So you start seeing these artists working on white canvas, white preparation layers, and letting it become a real part of the composition. So it's this ambiguity of, is she finished? Was this a sketch? Is it a finished picture? And you start getting this blurred line of finished, unfinished sketch, salon picture. And you see that very clearly here. Mm-hmm. And they were painting, yes, great slide. She read my mind.
It's magic.
It's magic. You see this a lot in Impressionism, and Nikki will talk about this in a little bit, but there's a huge radical departure from the salon. So the salon was very academic. You have artists that are working with very tiny brush strokes. They're trying to get these pristine surfaces. They're also painting with really dark colors. They're looking at the old master painters. They're really exemplified by these pristine, dark, gem-like surfaces. And the really radical shift in Impressionism comes in details like this, where you're using a luminescent white ground that is, in some cases, like this last image here, it's like 80% of the canvas. There's basically no paint on that painting. It's just the white ground and a few little dots of color. And that would have been crazy. Totally crazy at that time. They're really looking at, I think Cézanne was one of these influencers of the time, but you can see his beautiful brushwork that kind of just sits on that white background. And it's so beautiful.
So that
so
there is
radical.
ground.
Yes, all the white. So you see the white there and the white there. And of course in Van Gogh.
You can see that's the texture.
And that's also one of the advantages of having an industry, because they were buying and communicating preferences of their artist materials. So they were choosing white grounds, gray grounds, and absorbent grounds. And they were communicating this to the color makers and the artist suppliers, who were then adjusting for the evolving industry.
And so that leads something else as we start to think about, okay, so what's so radical? They weren't the first ones to paint on plein air. They weren't the first ones to paint the entire thing on plein air. They weren't the first ones to paint in the middle of the river in a boat. One of the things, though, that is pretty unique to them is this application of paint in divided brushstrokes. And it's the idea that rather than doing a lot of blending on your canvas, and as Laura was explaining, what was trained in the academy is that you wanted to erase any sign of the artist's hand. It was meant to look like a polished mirror. They go the opposite direction. So it's not to say they don't use their palettes to blend colors, but there's a lot more application of pure color from their collapsible metal paint tubes onto the canvas or onto the palette and applied directly. And in separating or dividing out color through different brush strokes, it creates that, again, that kind of optical illusion or sensation that they were trying to convey, that idea, again, of how we perceive light rather than how you know a flower looks. So that kind of short staccato brushwork, and we often say directional brushwork, is that the direction of the brushstroke can often be a descriptor in telling you what that thing is. I think Van Gogh's a master of it here. I'm just showing you a detail of Caillebotte applying that, because in addition to dividing their colors, they're also applying what was cutting-edge color theory at the time. So many of them really grasp onto the theory of contrasting complementary colors, which is the idea that if you take colors that are opposite each other, complementary colors, on the color wheel, like red and green, and you put them side by side, they actually kind of vibrate a little bit. And, I mean, we want to talk about the legacy of Impressionism, go look at Color Field. I mean, again, nothing's new under the sun. Many of them loved red and green. Here's Caillebotte, almost an entire composition in red and green. Van Gogh was obsessed with red and green. He'll do almost an entirely green landscape with a red border. And then when you zoom in and look, it's just such a great evocation of these directive brushstrokes. They're different shapes, they're different sizes, and they're different colors, to kind of, again, evoke or conjure what it is that's being depicted. It's not meant to be a photograph. It's the sensation, it's the feeling, it's the perception of what's there in nature. And always love to kind of point out red and green where you even don't expect to see it, little touches of pink and red where there's tons and tons of green. And then we get to pointillism. This is our fabulous Pissarro apple harvest, probably one of, I think, the strongest examples of pointillism ever, and we're lucky that it's here in the DMA's collection. But the Impressionists were applying it, this idea of divisionism and color theory, really intuitively, as you saw. It was more about almost gestural, right, in its application. And George Seurat will make it a science by, instead of big dashes and strokes of different colors, applying it these different pure colors from the tubes next to each other in tiny points of color, or points of light, as you like to call it. That's why we call it pointillism, little points of color. And the idea was that at a distance, your eye would do the blending that an academic painter would do on the palette. So I'm not gonna paint brown, I'm gonna put the colors that when you see them at a distance, mix into brown in your eye. Okay, it didn't work. If you see Seurat's paintings, they all look brown, which is unfortunate. Pissarro wasn't as literal as Seurat was, which is why I think you can taste the rainbow and see just how beautiful all the colors are in this picture. But again, you can see a much more scientific application. If you see the red dots right next to it, you will see green. If you see yellow, you're probably seeing violet, purple next to it, same with blue and with orange. So it's a beautiful illustration of that kind of color theory that all had the goal of increasing the vibrancy, working with those light-colored grounds that you talked about, again, to basically mimic light. Painting with light, we often describe Impressionism that way. So these are these innovative techniques that they are basically putting into practice to kind of push forward what they're trying to do with a new kind of, modern art. But even the color theory, even like the loose brushwork, that was not, in fact, what was so difficult, challenging, offensive, radical, political about what the Impressionists were showing when they organized their group exhibitions. They did 8 shows between 1874 and 1886. They came together because there was no market or audience, as I mentioned, for their radical style of painting, and there was no public venue in Paris to show your artwork, public, not commercial, but even then, really no avenue for you as an artist to show your work to the public, to have it reviewed by critics, to attract a clientele, if it wasn't the one time a year that the government sponsored what they called the Salon, the official Paris Salon exhibition that was juried by their appointed conservative academics who taught in the fine arts school. And when they mounted their pictures, what was most noticeable, most critiqued, whether people loved the paintings or hated them, which was most people, was that these weren't finished pictures. They were super sketchy. They're just sketches. And so, bad quality caricature, forgive me, but the idea here is basically that people hear that there's a painting and they're confused. They don't know what they're looking at. Because you could paint a sketch, great, bright colors, loose brushwork, sitting about all day, we love it, love it, love it. But if you're gonna put a frame on it and show it to the public and tell them this is fine art, this is not what it's supposed to look like. It's basically like you're there in your underwear. You're not fully dressed and presentable to the public, but they're passing off sketches as finished pictures to what was perceived as an innocent public that were having the wool pulled over their eyes. They were also charging admission to their group show, by the way. This didn't exist. You eventually had to pay to get into the salon. But this was to ask people to pay money to then see things that they don't understand didn't go over well. So just to give you a quick comparison of our friend Corot, we've seen him before. This looks huge, this is tiny. Corot, plein air sketch, Forest of Fontainebleau. He's in France, he's taken the train. He loves this oak tree. This is the salon picture. I don't know if you can see. This is that tree. It has now been transported to Jerusalem because this is a biblical history painting and it's huge, and this is what was expected at the salon. Laura, these are your dark colors.
Your dark colors and
in your studio.
Tiny brushwork.
Using your intellect, using your imagination. So, sketchy, awesome. We love sketchy. And sometimes these artists would show the sketch next to the finished picture in the salon so that people could marvel at the intellect of taking the raw data, the copying nature, and making something better. It's not just real, it's surreal. It's better than what you would find in nature, right? And also, educative in terms of teaching you about, biblical stories and whatnot. This is what Monet does. So we are incredibly fortunate that we have amazing collectors here in Dallas that are still collecting this material. So if you've been to see our show, you will see this painting by Monet on the left. That is small. They're not quite scaled on the screen there. The one on the left is Monet's sketch made in his boat in the water. And the one on the right was the larger finished picture he developed in his studio to submit to the Paris Salon. because the Impressionist venture was a failure. And when they realized that they were being panned in the press and they weren't making money, and these were starving artists at this time, you still had to go to the salon. It was the mark of professional success. So they didn't necessarily stop trying to get artwork in. So Monet, and painting on large scale, and taking studies, and polishing, so
working
polished.
in a studio.
Working in the studio. You know, this was him making submissions for the salon. Even he recognized, though, that this was probably this finished picture on the right, which is the scale of our Senate Lavacour, big, was still probably a little too edgy. And so instead, he took those studies in his studio, and these are the two that he will send to the jury to be judged to see if he can get it onto the walls in the Paris Salon. By the way, they were painted in winter, all of them. It was a rare moment when the Seine arms had frozen in a harsh spell, and he was fascinated by the ice flows when the rivers were breaking up. So they were all done in his little boat in a flash with freezing fingers, and in his studio, in a very academic way, one is a springtime picture and one is a winter picture. He submits them as pendants. Which one gets in? Based on what you're seeing on the screen, not what you might have read in one of my labels. You think the one on the left? Ours? Yeah, you're right. Why do you think that is? Compare the two. Hey! Here we see Daubigny's. Beautiful composition on large scale, by the way. Ours gets in, it's poorly hung in the salon, it hardly gets recognized, hardly any notice, it doesn't get him what he wants, he'll never submit again to the salon. But this brings me to another topic. We're gonna have to keep moseying through this now. But, okay, so you get into the salon. Then what happens? Well, your works are presented, you know that when we say salon style hang, this is from the actual salon. They were hung cheek to jowl. They started at the chair rail, and if you got very bad placement, you were skied, meant you were by the skylights, way up high. You didn't do the hang. Sometimes they were alphabetical, and it changed over the years. But all that to say is you as the artist would see your artwork installed, and the final step to signify this is a finished picture that is ready for public consumption was to varnish it. And they, in situ, would varnish the pictures. And for those who know French, if you know what the word for opening is in French for exhibitions, is vernissage, varnishing. It's varnishing day. It's the opening day. Done. And you're seeing in 1874, the year of the first Impressionist show, a painter who is showing one room, paintings we know were shown at the 1874 Salon, and what they look like. Naturalistic palette. Even in this little detailed picture, you get a sense of the style of what was accepted and how already different the Impressionist work are. So the interesting thing about this, though, is what the Impressionist would or would not do with the V word.
Right. And for us, I think, as viewers in today's world, I think it's pretty common knowledge that the Impressionists did not varnish their paintings. It's kind of become this known fact about them, but the varnish issue is actually quite complicated. And one of the ways early on that they would get around it was actually putting glass in front of the painting so that they could not varnish their surfaces. But it was a slow transition and very complicated. I won't get into it. We don't have time. But eventually, the group, that we know as the Impressionists really started hating varnish. And this was because it changed not only the tonality of their paintings, you can imagine those white grounds would saturate, they would change, the whole hue of the painting would completely alter, and Morisot, I think, is very famous in commenting that it removed that moment of impression, that first impression. It turned it into a finished artwork. Here's some really fun quotes. This first one is from Seurat, where he states in a letter, "It is appropriate that I tell you of my horror of varnish."
The horror.
The horror. And this other quote, or it's actually an inscription, is very famous. It's an inscription in Pissarro's hand on the back of a canvas that's in the Louvre's collection, and he literally writes on the back of the canvas, "Do not varnish." So pretty clear the sentiment of what they were getting at. We're super lucky in the DMA's collection that we actually have a lot of paintings that have undergone what I like to call benign neglect. They have not been touched. They have been left exactly how they left the artist studio, which is very, very lucky for us. We are showing this Vlaminck, which is currently in the exhibition, but will be going out on loan
We have a little
very soon.
like a little swap out, but something great is replacing it.
And
but
what's
it's still on
replacing
you.
it is also not varnished.
I know, it's amazing. There might be a Munch coming back from loan, so.
So go see it, but it gives you this understanding of what a pristine surface would have been. So you can see these brushwork, these details, the ground color, the appropriate contrast in the surface, and especially these tiny little details. So here's an up-close detail that could be a Van Gogh painting. You can see the underpainting, which is this like dilute cobalt brushwork, and it's all consistent with what the artist intended. So the issue of varnish is complicated, but was one of the starting points for our initial kind of exam of and kind of observation of the collection as a whole. And it was the moment to take those varnishes off, finally.
And for a curator to eat her hat when the conservator's like, this is so dirty or shiny, and I've got to get my hands on it. And I'm like, no one looks at it like a conservator. I look at paintings all the time with you. It's fine. It's not going to be dramatic. This is when we're going to show you now how many hats I have eaten in the course of Laura's treatment.
Well, you start looking at the pristine surfaces, and you realize even a varnish that isn't that discolored affects a picture. So this Baudin painting, this is the before treatment, and it's fine.
It's fine.
Good.
Looks great, right? Boudin, teacher of Monet, exhibited with the Impressionists. Lovely. Look at that blue sky. Look at those white clouds.
And then we start cleaning it, and you see just how dirty and discolored and saturating the varnish is. And
This is the line, her cleaning line, by the way.
You can see it. And then you look at the complete after treatment picture, and it's a completely different picture. And you see the smoke from the tugboat that is in contrast with the clouds, and you see details that you would not notice until the picture was cleaned. And that was subtle compared to this picture, which was a thorn in my side since I started here.
I was like, yeah, you want to clean it. It's fine. It's great.
And it really, every time I would look at it, it would just hurt
She'd be
me.
like, no, I really think it'll improve. I'm like, how could you possibly improve on this rosy, I don't know if it's a sunset or a sunrise. Look at that beautiful peachy pink glow on the street. I mean, this is Impressionism at its best, right? This is Sicily at its best. Thank you, Eugene and Margaret McDermott. Like, we are so lucky and grateful.
So I brought it up to the studio and started cleaning it, and it had what I like to call an earwax varnish because the Q-tip looks like earwax, which Nikki hates.
So gross. I can't. Please don't say that again.
But it was really discolored, and it was thick varnish. So it kind of was trapped between the interstices. It was really bad. And
surprise, it's not a sunset or a sunrise. In fact, it's just the middle of the day.
The middle of the day. So you can see why taking a varnish off can be, even subtle, can be a transformation, but in this case, completely change the art history perspective.
What we
of
write
the
about,
picture.
how we talk about color paintings completely changes.
So that's, that's what kind of gave us the incentive to look at the whole collection. And
there were some ODBs.
There were some ODBs. And this picture, again, was an untouched picture. I love this painting. It came in, it's a very early Munch painting. And what's fascinating is that you can see techniques that he will kind of move and use later in his more mature style. But it was very dirty, and it had a varnish, but what was more pressing was kind of this dulled surface. These paintings have lives before they come to the museum. This was probably in a room with a fireplace. So it was collecting soot and dirt and tobacco smoke over the years. You can see the color of the swab. This is just gray-black grime. And what was great is after removing that gray grime, we revealed a signature done in a pencil, a charcoal substance that we were able to preserve, which really wasn't visible before the cleaning. So there's always other benefits to cleaning a picture.
Yeah, see? I know. You were probably like, it looks
It looked
fine,
stormy.
right?
It looked like a stormy sky, and it's a fine day by the lake. So it can really alter a picture. Pissarro is, from that quote, you can tell he really wanted these pristine surfaces. And what's fascinating about his paintings is, and he states that they were often misinterpreted as pastels, but that he never really worked in pastel. And he has this like radical technique. And when I started cleaning it, it did not have a varnish, but it was very, very dirty. So removing that surface grime revealed these insane brush strokes and these colors that, he has a pretty pastel-y color palette overall, but then you have these like sharp moments of green and red that were kind of hidden. And the horse.
It's like, where did this come from?
The horse is so good.
It's like there's yellow in this
There's
painting?
yellow in the
red?
painting, there's green, and all of that was kind of hidden behind this grime. But this picture was the one that I was like, Nikki, you have to let me clean
I
this.
was like, seriously, it's fine.
She's like, just leave it on the wall. Like, it can't come off the wall. But
This picture's also, remember how this looks, because I always give this anecdote if you've ever come to any of my talks or heard me talk about this painting, is my favorite in the McDermott collection. We're not supposed to have favorites, but we all do. We have favorite children. It is the hardest painting in the collection to hang because it is so convincing, this illusion of sunlight. In this picture, it looks literally like a window has been opened on the wall. It projects so much light, it makes it extraordinarily difficult to hang any other Impressionist work around it that are often more subtle, let's say. And just so you know, in the exhibition where you see it, I have to dim the lights on the Caillebotte so that it's even with the reflection of light from everything that's around it. So I'm like, oh, conservators, they just want to clean everything. Look how bright this is. Like, come on, now, you're pulling my leg.
And the brushwork is just so beautiful. So these are details before cleaning, and it was already so beautiful. And this is 2 photomicrographs, so seen under the microscope, of his technique. So he's using these insane colors, and his brushwork is super chunky. And because of that, every brush stroke was holding not only kind of like a layer of dirt, but also a layer of old varnish residue. So you can imagine how difficult it is to clean something like that. So in this situation, I had to come up with some creative solutions.
So the Impressionists weren't the only ones who were innovative and revolutionary, by the way.
This is actually a technique that comes from treating contemporary art, and especially those kind of complicated, very stubborn surfaces, and I actually ended up using kind of like a jelly that I would make with my cleaning solution, which allowed me to put the cleaning solution on the surface so you can see there's my gummy bear, I like to call it, and you cut out your section and place it on each individual kind of stubborn brush stroke, because they're very, very, very fragile. So you start cleaning, you realize it's like peaks of paint from the brush that just stayed. So you can use these innovative techniques to get a pretty powerful before and after effect. And you can see the before picture. It was beautiful, but after cleaning, you just have a completely different understanding. Like this brush stroke at the top looked black or gray, but it was really like a pastel pink.
Yeah.
So it's pretty transformative cleaning. And again, you can see this area that was just kind of gray and grimy and then came out so beautiful. And you start seeing those color tones that Nikki was describing that
were so important to them.
That were so important to them. So the red and the green, which was completely hidden under years and years of grime and dirt before.
So we know your
Nikki
time
makes
is precious.
the best slide.
We will stay and answer questions. I know I had a little bit too much fun with this. But I think it would be good to share some of these discoveries.
Yeah.
And I promise we are now getting to the end, and then we will be really happy to chat with you all and answer questions you might have. But there were some really fun discoveries that Laura made that, again, can change how you interpret things, can change how you see a picture through the course of the treatment. So we thought we'd show you just a few. The first is another one of these that came in through that recent Heinz collection gift. You'll see it upstairs on level 2. Again, a really superb plein air sketch by Cicely. Here, we kind of know that this was probably begun, in one fell swoop, small picture, lots of exposed ground, as we've been talking about, really sketchy. This one I knew was kind of flat and dirty. I don't know if I expected it to be quite the transformation, but the discovery was, in fact, it's not just a landscape, but they're actually his children. But because the hat and the face weren't differentiated from things that look like they're brown in a landscape, I actually didn't know they were there. And so when she cleaned it, and then I suddenly saw this kind of spot that always kind of grabbed my eye, but I couldn't really read what they were. I'm like, oh my God, it's his daughter and his son, and they're sitting in the landscape. And that just adds a whole other level of appreciation and understanding. So that was a fun discovery of just like, I've been staring at this thing for 3 years, and I cannot believe suddenly that this is jumping out, that this is what this is. And then there was some fun discoveries, too, that Laura made with the McDermott Water Lily Pond, or Clouds, by Monet. Monet, I think, is the poster child for plein air painting, beginning to end. He represents Impressionism, and here you are seeing him depicted by others throughout decades of his very long productive career painting on plein air. So in the 1870s, Renoir showing him in his garden at Giverny, little canvas, little easel. Then we have Sargent who's visiting, who's showing him on the edge of a wood, not that, like a decade or something later. Painting on plein air, yes, this is Monet. He only paints on plein air outside, right? In 1915, Sacha Guitry is making a film, and he includes artists, sort of living treasures, if you will. They go to Giverny. This is a still from the film, and there is, Monet with his fabulous flowing beard and a cigarette dangling with ash out of his mouth.
It's a crazy film.
It's a crazy film. Watch it on
watch
YouTube.
It.
Painting a giant water lily next to the pond. So there's this myth for him in particular, and this we hold up as the icon and definition of plein air painting Impressionism. But
so I start cleaning this picture, and you almost immediately start seeing brushstrokes that don't make sense. And I think this is very famous for Monet's paintings. And you start wondering what is going on. So you can see this is in subtle raking light. And I think the next
slide, yeah.
Slides make it more obvious.
Much better.
But you have these long brushstrokes that don't make sense.
Yeah.
Why are they purple? Where did they come from?
They're not describing what you see on the surface, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I x-rayed the painting. And by the way, this is the cleaned painting. You can see how beautiful it looks. This is another one that nobody.
Her day, by the way.
Yeah,
because,
this was an obsession of mine to clean this for a long time, and
it now's the time.
Just looks so good. But in the X-ray, you start seeing information that is not on the surface. So I kind of traced all
It's
the
hard
areas.
for us lay people to know what she sees it, and it's so clear to her. Like, what are we looking at in this X-ray?
I traced everywhere that didn't correlate with the overlying composition, and then once you put it on the
So those are the
painting,
shapes that she sees on the surface and in the X-ray.
Exactly. You notice that actually he had painted 10 extra lily pads that he painted out. You have kind of this organic grass that he painted out. You also have a shadow or a cloud formation that he painted out to get to the composition. And it's a very complicated extremely labored painting for somebody that is depicted so often painting outside. And with a cigarette, very...
Yeah. And it's and now we have discovered through all of these types of technical studies, he did this all the time. Mm-hmm. You see a water lily, you should know it didn't start there. And then there's an artist like Van Gogh who people think is so belabored, and in fact.
Yeah. And then you see this Van Gogh, Our Riverbank in Springtime, and when you take an X-ray, there's not an extra brushstroke in sight. It is exactly one-to-one, alla prima. He paints it all at the same time. And if you look even closer, he doesn't even have a ground on his canvas. It's just a piece of canvas that he starts painting. And all his brushstrokes are actually very limited. We think of Van Gogh using a lot of paint, but the more time you spend on his paintings, the brushstrokes are thick, but there aren't that many in a lot of these.
And perfect timing for our conclusion, for our talk tonight, is that we were thinking, Laura's like, okay, like, you know, what are some of our favorite moments in the studio together or looking together from this project? And for me, it's not like a close encounter with one particular picture. It's actually the perfect marriage of the curator and the conservator of art history, of science, coming together with the different sets of knowledge and the overlap between and how we look at things together. If you have come to any of the shows that I have worked on in recent years, you'll know that conservation, technical study, what we learn from conservators and this type of exam and study and cleaning, I believe is where the new information's coming from in our field. It's kind of like the new frontier. So it is a perfect match. We do not play by anyone else's rules. We have a lot of fun, as you can tell, in what we do. Here's some of the projects, sort of, as we always like to say, caught in the wild, of looking at, you know, Van Goghs and Gris and talking about paint and pigment. So I think we can probably like conclude there with just how important these two fields are. And not just in the museum, but the museum setting today is still the only place where you get this kind of partnership, where these kinds of new discoveries, innovations are made, and not only in interpretation, art history, what we know about these artists, what we know about this time period, but as you see from Laura, even developing new techniques to clean these pictures. She's also a specialist of mend repair, and if a painting has a hole in it, this is your doctor, but it's these things that are happening behind the walls that you wouldn't normally get to see, and we are just thankful to have the opportunity to come together to share some of that excitement, as you can see, and love for what we do with you all. So with that, I know we're right at 8, but if you want to stay and chat with us, we will stay and chat with you probably for the next 15 minutes or so. So our colleague Shannon has a microphone, and Bora. And we do ask, that you raise your hand and speak into the mic so everyone can hear you.
Oh, thank you for keeping time.
Yeah, I was the timekeeper, and I'm a bad one at
You're
that.
You're really good.
Okay. Hi. I just wanted to ask if there was a project that you've ever worked on that was low-key, like, or just like the most difficult project that you've had in terms of cleaning, almost to the point of it's impossible to deal with?
I did clean a painting here that was made out of sawdust. I don't have time to get into the specifics, but contemporary art can really throw curveballs. And I think like the less paint that's on a canvas, the more difficult, because you can't hide behind anything. But probably the sawdust painting.
I don't know if it was difficult, but there was also the time that she was treating color field paintings on that little courtyard outside of the painting studio on the second floor on the Ross Avenue side using white bread, like Wonder Bread. She has the most fun job. Can we just acknowledge that?
You gotta get
She's
experimental.
like, today I cleaned, a Rothko with a slice of Wonder Bread. Like, sure.
That's another talk for a different day, but it gets interesting.
Hi, I am wondering about like the planning and the logistics of setting up the exhibit that's next door. Like, surely you didn't clean all these paintings like 2 weeks before they were going to go on. So what does that sort of like planning and partnership look like? And how long did it take you to get ready for what's next door?
Well, I get in there early. Like, as soon as I hear any like hallway talk of an exhibition, I'm like, what? Nikki, are we really doing an Impressionist exhibition? Can I start cleaning these tomorrow? But it always starts with a conversation and a survey. Something of the scale, I think honestly, we work really well together and we know the collection really well. I was here when a lot of the McDermott pictures came in. I know that collection really well. We know the Hines collection well. Nikki spearheaded that, and she actually knew those pictures so well that she came to me with her list, her kind of wish list. So it starts.
I'm not totally useless. I just start with the more obvious things.
So it takes a lot of
It does take a
planning.
lot of time, though, because you're right. It wasn't all done in 2 weeks, and we do not try to denude the galleries of Impressionism. I have a rule that we had to break to prepare for this, which is I do not leave empty holes on the wall. I don't care if it's a couple days, okay, but you are visitors, you come, and you want to see, I hope, wonderful artwork that's inspiring and that's complete. So I try to avoid this. I hope that you have, before we started planning for this, not ever seen holes on the walls of my galleries, because we lend Impressionism all the time too. So we're always up there changing things, even if it looks like it's static. It is not. But for this, we had to start. And so it was a massive group effort once we had the checklist for the exhibition. And this was actually, as I like to say, 3 shows in one, because most of the Impressionism was either on view in the Reeves Collection galleries or in the permanent collection galleries. So that was being prepared for Chilton. And then the Hines collection, we wanted to show together as this private collection. We had the opportunity on the 2nd floor because we had removed the other Impressionist works. And then what wasn't Impressionism, we still had a massive gallery to fill. So it was basically 3 projects all at once. I'm looking at one of my wonderful researchers, Shelby, because we're really tired. I always like to say, why do 1 show when you can do 3 all at once and stress out all of your colleagues? So if you came to the museum and you went to level 2, I would say probably starting 3 or 4 months out from the opening of the Chilton show, I set a limit of no more than 3 paintings at a time could be in the conservation lab. We came up with what we thought were funny, because you can tell we love our own jokes, some sort of like cheeky signage on the wall, because there wasn't time to replace them with other things. That was, do you miss, it was a glow up. It's like, do you miss this painting? It's gone for its glow up. Go up and look at it through the conservation window and read more and scan this QR code to learn about conservation, at the DMA. So there was a time when it probably didn't feel so great upstairs, but we did a good job to tell people what was coming and build the excitement before we could have kind of the grand reveal in Chilton, then with the Hines collection, which no one had seen, really, upstairs on the 2nd floor. So it was, this was intensive.
It was intense. It was like Impressionism boot camp.
Yeah. And our colleagues in collections who had to also do the Tetrising of the calendar, and we have school groups and docents, and we never close the European galleries all at once so that people can still come and see certain things. It is a terrible game of Tetris that we are very glad we don't have to mastermind. Yeah. Now we're starting to talk about putting it back. She's coming, Bora's coming.
Putting it back.
Putting it back. All good things must come to an end.
My wife just asked if you do paintings for outside of the Dallas Museum. I wanted that too, but I wanted to thank you for an incredibly edifying evening. I mean, what people don't understand is how much work actually goes into the creation of a museum show, and we're just talking conservation, much less all the other things that happen. That someday it would be great to have a talk just from beginning to end of showing what really happens in the creation of a show. What I wanted to say is that I've been involved with painting conservation as a client for close to 50 years. And what I've seen in that process is a great change going back and forth between, we've just come up with the most amazing thing, and then the next time I go, oh my God, we should have never done that, and we are now doing X. And one of the things that I remember vividly is when one of the top conservators in Dallas told me flat out, any painting over 100 years needs to be lined. And when they said that, even I thought, why? But that was something that was apparently real important back in the 80s. And then they were talking about varnishes, and one of the varnishes that they were talking about, they'd come up with a new plastic varnish that they were really excited about.
Yeah, no, we hate that.
Well, actually, it was literally like the next time I went again, it was, oh my God, we'll never do that again.
Right.
And so there is this evolution that takes place that's really fascinating to me in the process. So I guess the question more than anything else is there something now, other than her question, is there something now that you are playing with that you're probably going to look back and go, gosh, we probably shouldn't have done that?
That's a good question. I will say that conservation, especially in the last 30 years, has changed significantly. So I have a Master's of Science degree with a chemistry undergrad, a BS in chemistry, and we are now much more in development of our own industry, much like the Impressionists. But we have really shifted from like a prophylactic approach where we line things so that nothing ever happens to a complete turn to minimal intervention. So the philosophy that I work under is less is more. So as little as we can touch a painting actually is better. And we didn't get to these slides. Nothing permanent, everything reversible. So there's a number of reasons for that. I'm working on a project right now that you'll probably hear about that focuses specifically on this issue of how do you treat paintings without altering or shifting a single part of the painting. So my tear mending technique is very much in line with this. Because you don't want to use a varnish that will give you false results when you're looking at pigments, at grounds, that actually shifts the chemical composition of a work of art and changes the interpretation of the materiality. You also have situations like this.
Yeah, you might need to explain actually lining.
Yeah, so lining is a technique that was very popular, and people still do it, especially kind of conservators or restorers that were trained back in the day. And it's a technique where where if a painting is flaking or if there's a tear, you like line it, you paste it onto another piece of canvas. And this is supposed to kind of stop everything from happening. So we've really shifted.
And so you would apply that how?
With heat and solvent and moisture.
It's like taking glue and another piece of fabric and pressing with pressure and like ironing and heat. And it crushes impastos.
Mm-hmm. It changes everything.
They sometimes used wax and it has an oil.
Yeah.
You know, when your candles stain your tablecloth, you can't get that back.
Yeah.
It changes.
It's terrible.
The pigments and the canvas.
They meant well.
Yeah.
You know, but the philosophy has just changed so much. And I really specialize in Spanish colonial painting and 19th century painting and contemporary art, which are all things that are like, you can't even look at them without changing them. So the techniques have had to change because now we are studying these areas from the artist's intent, from the creator's perspective, and looking at the materiality as evidence of history and of culture, and they are three-dimensional objects as opposed to kind of pictures, flat pictures on a canvas. So this, I think, is a good example of why you wouldn't want to line something.
I think it's this one.
So it is the most beautiful Signac, completely untouched, and here's another one.
Two Signacs that came in through private collections, and he was not popular.
Yes.
So he didn't get messed with.
Exactly. So I think like the joke in conservation is your Rembrandt will always get treated first and over again. But then you have these artists that were underappreciated for a long time, but you have situations where they're completely untouched. This painting has never been removed from the stretcher.
That doesn't exist, by the way.
Yeah. It has all the same tacks that were there from the beginning. It's just never been touched. So why would we ever take, to line a painting, you'd have to completely take this apart. So all the techniques that I'm developing that I use are based on leaving a painting untouched. And then you have all your canvas stamps that you can preserve.
Which are actually really important bits of information that get lost when you line it. You lose that. They weren't photographed in the 1950s and 60s, is I think when lining had its heyday. Especially if you bought 19th century French pictures through Wildenstein Gallery in Paris and New York. They are all lined.
They're all lined.
But this tells us also it helps you date pictures because that's actually the name of the fabricator, the supplier that sold these. And sometimes they only existed with this name or with this punctuation or this kind of stamp in an 8-year period. It can be used to help authenticate, not always, but it can. I mean, this is really valuable information. Sometimes there's also like collector stamps for provenance and history of ownership, all gone when you line a picture. So we freak out when we see things like this.
So the goal really is to keep pictures untouched now.
Yeah.
To use materials that are reversible and sympathetic to the materials of the painting.
Yeah, so when you see those two Signacs, know that what you're looking at for the most part is as
special.
close as the artist, time, and the conservator can get you to what the artist would have wanted you to experience when you see those colors in that surface.
You mentioned that, what I wanted to say, Wildenstein was aligning everything. One of the things I'd like to add is that it's actually probably the reason that most of the Impressionist paintings that ended up being varnished, it was dealers, it wasn't the collectors involved, because unfortunately they thought that they were easier to sell that way because it brightened the painting
Exactly.
beyond what it was.
Well, and we didn't mention this about varnishing too, but the artists in the time weren't doing it. But to your point, if you were going to suddenly double in contemporary art in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, everything else on your wall was varnished. And so the dealers would do it to make it more saleable. This also is true that Impressionists also, not for this talk, but had pretty radical ideas about frames. And we don't have those original frames anymore because collectors didn't want to see it in a white strip frame, their Seurat or their Van Gogh. They were used to seeing things in 18th century style Rococo gilded, beautiful frames that you will see all of ours in. Those weren't picked by the artists. Those were dealers or collectors later that wanted it to fit. This is decoration, let's be honest. This is made to be lived with in the home, and so that matters. So it wasn't that things got varnished, for no reason at all. And sometimes we don't like varnish, we like to remove it, but it also is a protective layer. So, museums in many ways, we rely on it because people do get close and excited and they want to look with their fingers. And if they touch a surface and it has the varnish, it's actually a protective layer. So when we do these treatments, when Laura does, we have to go back to the piece of glass, in a way, because now the risk for damage is that you're staining unpainted canvas or that you're actually scraping off original paint and not a varnish that, everyone and their brother applied over the decades to make it nice and saturated and shiny. I think we have time probably for one more question, or we can set everyone free into their Thursday night. Man in the Blue.
Loved the Van Gogh olive groves and learned so much about how they went outside for the first time. And as you showed, found that there were pieces of bugs and pieces of grass and all that. Does that represent what special problems do those represent in the conservation process?
Well, that's where these new being careful with cleaning approaches and using the gel to clean the surface allows you to retain all the moisture at the top. So you're just being extra careful because now you're dealing with organic matter. We have microscopes. We do a lot under the microscope. I think in the past, especially old school kind of restorers in the 19th century would just go to town on cleaning a painting, but now we really spend time looking under the microscope. So if there is a cricket's leg stuck in the paint,
It was a grasshopper.
It stays there, and we are able to preserve every element of the paint in a more thoughtful, kind of focused way.
But actually, I'll say one last thing about that, and thank you. I'm glad that you came and saw the show and enjoyed it, and that was a big part of, the work. But the project actually started when I was a curator at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. They have one of these Van Gogh olive grove paintings, And there was the question about pigment fading, and when he describes in his letters these purple shadows in the olive groves, and none of them have them. That's kind of where it started. But we were really interested in then the sequencing of the series, because it was punctuated by a long period of illness, and trying to kind of sort out some questions we had about when things were made and related to other works. And when the conservator there, who I worked very closely with, was doing this examination, I'll never forget this, sitting at my desk, and she calls me, which was not out of the ordinary, and she was so excited, and she's a pretty calm person, so that was, and she said, "You are never going to believe this. You need to come up here right now to the conservation studio." She's like, "You just have to come and look at this." So she was examining the olive groves, and I go up, and I look through the microscope, and I'm like, "Oh my God, it's the leg of a bug." And again, none of you will necessarily know this, but I have kind of a weird attraction, repulsion to insects. I have to know a lot about bugs for some reason, and I was like, I will put my money on it that this is a grasshopper. By the way, it's teeny tiny millimeters. You have to see it under a microscope. So I was very proud of myself. You know, I can identify things. We did it recently too with like, I know these eggs on this painting, which happens. I have these in my garden. And so it was this kind of amazing moment though, from the conservation point of view. She wanted to keep it in the paint. It was tiny. It had a bit of, you can Google this actually and see this. It made news. It went around. You'll see those photomicrographs of this little leg. And there's a bit of paint. It's kind of embedded in the paint. But at the moment, we were trying to date the pictures, and I went straight to, what kind of insect is this? What season would it have been, summer or fall? What is this? When did it come out of the ground? In San Remy, in the asylum, and you know, this is not carbon dating, it's not that old, but like, what can this answer in terms of these art historical questions that started that whole scientific research project, which is the dating, the sequence, can we tell what season this was in? So we ended up working with a forensic entomologist at the University of Kansas, which is about an hour away from Kansas City, Missouri, where the museum is, to come to the studio. And I told you, they have the best jobs. Like, we just get to like come up to the lab sometimes and see cool stuff to actually look at it, because we were so excited that he could tell us what kind of bug this was. I had read through all the letters again. I was starting to look through almanacs about, was it a dry spring? Was it a dry summer? Like everything that he needed to kind of talk about what kind of genus, species, this, and that, of everything that could have been. And our hopes were immediately dashed because the little bug was not alive when it got lodged into the picture, and he could tell because of the remnants and how they were placed, like, you know, the head wouldn't be growing out of the foot kind of a situation, which was so upsetting. But before that, I was saying, like, we've got to take samples, we've got to get it out of the paint and give it to the entomologist before we learned it was a dead end. For dating anyways. And the conservator was like, you are not taking anything out of this painting. It is in the paint, it's original, and these are the debates we have of like, no, I'm sorry, this leg doesn't belong here. It's still there, by the way.
Well, and we aren't the last people to interact with these paintings.
Yeah, that's fair.
And that's,
I would not want it destroyed, but...
And so our tools keep getting smaller and smaller. So that the work that we do can be more precise and tinier. I present at and go to a an analyst conference every year, and I think they invite me because they get bored of like crime scenes, and then they like the one painting talk. But we take a lot from that technology, so all of our investigation and research gets tinier and tinier, so that we don't have to take the little guy out of there.
It's like the conservator's like, this is so cool, look, evidence of plein air painting. And I'm like, get me the almanac. When did the grasshoppers come out of the ground? So dead end ended up telling us nothing that we didn't already know about Van Gogh painting on plein air. But again, that marriage of even more scientists coming in. And I can tell you a lot about the forensic remnants of a grasshopper skull. If you ever want to know, we can chat about that. So on that note...
He probably dropped the canvas.
Yeah, exactly. I know, it's like, it probably just got smushed into the corner of the wet paint when he was like sweeping out, you know, the cell he lived in at the asylum. It's probably, I have also learned that grasshopper shells are like fingernails. They last for a really long time. They'll be here even when we're not, I think, so not dateable. Thank you for coming out tonight. We hope we shared all kinds of knowledge, high and low. Get up close, look at the pictures, tell your friends, and thank you again for supporting the museum. Good night.